Welcome. My name is Nils-Eric Sahlin. I'm a professor of medical ethics at Lunds University, philosopher, and I'm also one of the members of the national group on Council on Ethics, medical ethics in Sweden, and I'm vice chairman of the European Group of Ethics and New Technologies, which is in Brussels, and giving advice to the European Commission. And with me today, we are going to discuss the Council. The Swedish Council has today published our report on gene editing, somatic and germline editing. And we are going to talk about that, and I'm going to talk about it with two prominent guests and lawyers. And that, saying that lawyers scares me to death. But let's see what comes out of that. On my left here, I have Hank Greely, who is professor of law at Stanford University, but he's also the director of the Bioethical Center at Stanford. Something else probably
Close,
too.
But yes.
Yeah.
Close enough.
And we have Elisabeth Rynning, who is a well-known Swedish lawyer, professor of law. And you were the former, what's the title? You were...
My most recent work, or what?
Your most recent work
Well, I was the Chief Parliamentary Ombudsman of Sweden.
That's the title, which is very impressive. And you also have been in the Supreme Administrative Court in Sweden.
Yes.
And we will talk about this. We said that I say a few words about the report, why we wrote the report and how it relates to other reports. And it will not take long because the report is 244 pages, I think, and it would take the afternoon if I went through it. And then Hank wanted to say a few words to begin with, and Elisabeth might say a few words, and we go on from there. So much of the recommendations we will discuss together later. Why do we write a report on gene editing when there are so many reports out there? The German Ethics Council wrote 5 years ago, I think it was, a very thick report on gene editing. Nuffield Council wrote also a report. The British Council on Ethics wrote a report on gene editing, and so did WHO, and in Brussels, EGE recently published a report on gene editing. Do we need still another report? I think it's an important question because there are several answers to it. First, the field, the scientific field, develops in a very rapid pace. And what we knew 3 years ago, we still know, but we have also added much new knowledge, which is important if you want to assess the risks and benefits of these techniques. Another reason is that I think it is very important that you go through the legal landscape, and we might do that today, and ask what is regulated and what is not regulated. What laws do we have to think about, and what soft laws are there that we have to think about? And there are several international declarations and conventions that we have to keep in mind. So that is one thing we have done, Smer has done, and to find where we have good regulations, and also try to pinpoint areas where we do not have the regulations. And then, of course, we have spent a lot of time on the ethical questions, and we try to say, if some advanced therapies or uses of these technologies can be ethically problematic, and if they are, for which reasons. And that's also something we spend a lot of time in the report on. I find these new techniques very exciting. Genome engineering is an extremely broad field. We can do a lot of things, and we often forget how many things we can do. We can use it in healthcare to help people who are suffering a lot. Hopefully, we can help them to a better life, either cure them or prevent further illness or relieve their pains. But we can also use the techniques to enhance our abilities, if we like. And enhancement is, of course, a problematic thing here. Hank, I read your face, might not agree, but we can also use it to disenhance ourselves. I've spoken to people with deaf children, or who are deaf, and want a child who is deaf, and could use the technique in order to disenhance, from our perspective, this child. We can use them in other areas. We can get new crops. We can have breed new type of animals that are for us better to eat. And most exciting might be that we can use the technique to develop so-called gene drives, by which we can extinct or eradicate an entire species. But we can also save a species on the verge of being eradicated. And it's not that we can do one thing at a time. What excites me the most, and which is seldom discussed, and we are not going to discuss it today either, is that we can do all the things at the same time and simultaneously and get very good results. So Smer is focusing on the techniques used as, let's say, advanced therapies within the healthcare system, basically, with some exceptions. And we agree with much of what has written here earlier. And for example, we agree with many of the other groups who have discussed it, that today germline editing, that is editing people so that it will go on to the editing will go on to the next generation, is forbidden today and should remain so until we know that we can do it in a safe way and that we do not have any effects that we do not like. And if that comes, then we can maybe rethink our decision to ban this, but before that, the ban should remain. Another thing we have discussed in this report, which I think is something that hasn't been done, and you don't find internationally, Hank can correct me, but that is that we are worried about using somatic genome editing outside the healthcare system. And this means that we allow different companies to develop this form of therapies, and you can go to a clinic and they help you to get smarter, you can get more beautiful or stronger. And I think you will not find a clinic where they offer you to be more moral. That's never on the agenda, but that might be. So this is a sort of thing. So we think that there should be a ban on applications outside the healthcare system, advanced therapies outside the healthcare system. And we can discuss the pros and cons of this. And we have a number of other recommendations, but let's take them as we continue or start our conversation. But Hank, please, you wanted to say a few words.
Talk. And talk to the Statens medicinsk-etiska råd. I hope I got close to right on that. Both for inviting me here, but more importantly for your report. Now, I have to confess, I've only read the summary in English, so I have about 220 pages, I think, that I have not read. But I was very impressed with the summary, and I think this may be the most useful of the many reports that have been put out on this topic. I wrote a book about the CRISPR babies in Hejianghui and the general topic of germline genome editing, published in February of last year, and read all of the reports. And there are many. But what I thought was particularly striking about your report was how practical it was. Now, part of that is the advantage of writing a report with respect to one country. So when the WHO writes a report, it can't say, you need to change this regulation here in this particular way. And similarly, the National Academy of Sciences and the Royal Society in the UK have had a commission producing many reports on this, and they're at a level of generality that is important, but perhaps not as immediately useful. I thought your report was provided specific recommendations in the context of a particular country, legislation, culture that would be very useful. The other two things I'd particularly note from it, I really liked the fact that your report focuses more on processes than on prescriptions. So it's not just we do this, we don't do this. It's we set up a process to watch this. We set up a process to follow this over time. This is not an area where there's going to be a decision at one date that will last forever. Things are changing. Things will continue to change. Certainly the science will continue to change. The alternatives to genome editing will also continue to change, and the cultures will continue to change. We should not really be thinking about regulating for our great-grandchildren, because when our great-grandchildren get here, if we have great-grandchildren, and there's still a here for them to be, it will be a different world, and it will be their world. It won't be our world. So the idea of setting up processes I thought was very important. The other substantive thing I would note, and you've already noted, the idea of regulation of somatic gene therapy for non-medical uses is, I think, quite important. Now, that's one where it depends on your country and the legal structure. In the United States, our Federal Food and Drug Administration would take the position that it can regulate even non-medical uses of this technology. That hasn't been tested in court yet, but I think they would probably be upheld. But in many countries, there is no regulator. And it seems that in Sweden is one of those countries that doesn't have a strong regulatory system, except unless it's cosmetic surgery, et cetera. One thing that worries me very much is quacks. I don't know whether that term is widely understood in Sweden, but it's people taking advantage of the desperation of sick people to make money by offering things that don't work. If I believed in hell, I would believe they would be in the lowest circle of it. And whenever there's a new technology, it provides new feeding grounds for quacks. In my country, there are 500 stem cell clinics. None of them sells anything that has been FDA approved or proven to be safe and effective. They're all illegal, but they all continue, and they take people's money, and they raise people's hopes, and they dash them. So with somatic gene therapy for non-medical uses, I worry very much about quacks, and I think it's very, and it's not just the hard-hearted, conscious quacks. There are true believers who think they're actually doing good, even though there's no evidence of it. I think that's an important regulatory step that I haven't seen discussed enough. I think right now the ability to do any meaningful genetic enhancement is very, very slight, but in some ways that will change. Probably not, I think, for things like intelligence or morality, but things like perhaps strength, perhaps not, perhaps things like baldness or hair color or other issues like that. I think those could happen. Not yet, but there'll be people who will be willing to sell them for a high price, even though they're not yet proven safe and effective. So I was particularly impressed by that aspect of the report. But in general, I thought the report was remarkably useful. And I view that as very high praise.
Thank you. Elisabeth.
Well, thank you, Nils-Eric. I can only agree with everything Hank said, and I also only read the summary. there is not very much, I would say, to object against in the recommendations and the findings of the Council. I agree in particular with the fact that it's important to have the correct procedures, and it's very difficult to regulate areas of uncertainty where the risks to ourselves and to future generations are more or less unknown. We have to move carefully, step by step, not saying no to the possibilities, but being very careful and also thinking about future generations and implications for our society. The overview of legislation is very helpful and very good, but it does not really suffice to give us a clear view of where changes are needed. It points out gray areas where we don't really know what is covered and what is not covered by the existing legislation, and it doesn't say that it will. So it more or less points out that there is really a big need for a more in-depth analysis of existing legislations on all levels, global, regional, national. What is covered, what is not covered? Who could legislate the areas that are yet not covered? Who has the competency and who will be listened to? Who can enforce these rules? We talked about the need for global consensus. I'm a bit, pessimistic about finding, skeptical is a good word as well, about finding such global consensus. But we still need to strive for it, aim for it, and have a discussion at the global level as well as on the national, domestic level. And here we come to the need for ethical discussions, public debate. What kind of society do we want to live in? How do we see ourselves as humans? What do we expect for the future? And I think this kind of report is extremely helpful to generate that kind of debate that will need to go on more or less, I would say, perpetually as we go along this very exciting and interesting path with a lot of opportunities and possibilities, but also a bit scary in the way of risks of various types.
Can I follow directly on that? Two things that you inspire me to think about or talk about. One is the idea that you have to be constantly watching, particularly with interpretations. When Dolly the sheep was born, some of you may be old enough to remember the great hysterical outcry. We went from one sheep to armies of cloned warrior slaves, and people overreacted. But the Brits said, in their very smugly British way, oh, not to worry, we've already banned it. And it turned out, in their 1990 regulations under their Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority, they had a sentence that said, we hereby ban human reproductive cloning. But then they defined human reproductive cloning, and it was a definition that was different from what was done to make Dolly the sheep. So we need constant review, because sometimes the science takes turns that we don't anticipate, and we need to be able to revise. And the general point to this, so my university, Stanford, is very good at raising money to build buildings. It's fairly easy in rich Silicon Valley to get people to give you money to build buildings. To give you money to maintain the buildings, to staff the buildings, to buy the laboratory equipment for the buildings, that's very hard. It's relatively easy, I think. It's easier to get legislation passed than it is to follow it up, monitor it, see where it's working, where it's not working. We need to think about things not as points in time, but as long-term processes. And I think this is a nice example of it. The other thing I'd say, there's an interesting question before you that, at least in the summary, the report didn't deal with, or didn't see it. And that's a question of how broadly or narrowly to look at these issues. Do you want an agency or an entity devoted to looking at genome engineering, or human genome engineering, or human body changing technologies? One of the areas I work in is neuroscience. And we're not close in either area, but we're less distant from doing human enhancement with neurological implants than we are with genes. It raises similar issues. Do we end up wanting a bunch of different bodies dealing with each different technology, or one body to deal with them all? There are pluses and minuses to each approach. But it's something I think countries will increasingly have to make decisions about.
But don't you think that, and this is one of the things that we are discussing in the report, we also, as many other councils, saying that we need is global administrative or whatever units discussing this, and also on a national level. But the question is, what is happening in the agricultural area is not, I tried to say this to the beginning, it's connected to what you will do with humans and somatic applications.
Yes.
It's all connected, and so isn't the answer to your question or what you said that we need all sort of bodies here looking into different things, or is that just too much?
So I don't know is the honest answer. It's probably the most honest answer I'll give to anything. But I think there are disadvantages of having separate units. They tend to live in their own silos. And so one of the things I love about my university is we're very interdisciplinary, and people at the medical school talk to people in the law school and talk to people in the psychology department and so on. But not every place is like that. If you've got one unit looking at human genetics and another unit looking at animal genetics and another unit looking at human neuroscience, will they come together enough to be able to sense you're right, there are connections there and they affect each other. But if they're in different units, will they be as able to see those and deal with them? On the other hand, our brains are only so big. And how many times can you find, can you make a unit that is able to find people who are able to deal with neuroscience and animal genetics and human genetics and the next technologies that come around? So there are pluses and minuses to either a unified structure or a distributed structure. And I think the answer may lie more in the political culture, maybe even the academic culture of particular countries than in a general answer.
Can I return to one thing you said at the beginning, Hank, and that was that the quacks worried you because they promise you everything, they give you nothing, and they take your money. But another possibility here, isn't it that we will see the big companies, they have the muscles, they have the technology, they can develop therapies and sell them outside the healthcare system. What would happen? What will happen then?
So that's an interesting question. And again, my honest answer is I don't know. But in a way, the larger companies are easier to deal with. They have things to lose. They have assets to lose. They have money to lose. If they get sued, they have a reputation to lose. The physician who's opening her own shop to do gene therapy for baldness, she has some things to lose, but she doesn't have the same extent of committed assets. And she also doesn't come from an entity that has a culture of having to deal with regulation. So if you're talking in a big company in terms of a pharmaceutical company, they know how to deal with regulation. They don't necessarily like dealing with regulation, but they've got vast numbers of people who deal with regulation, and having to deal with another regulatory system, well, okay, we know how to do that, we can do that. And it's a bit of an advantage to them because it keeps out the lesser companies that aren't as good at dealing with regulation. So I think the big companies could be a problem. I think more likely they are going to be a little more risk averse and a little more cautious, and hence a little easier to control. They're also more visible, which also helps. If AstraZeneca, does that still exist? The drug companies are changing their names so quickly I can't remember. But if they do something, everyone knows about it. If a mom and pop shop someplace in Lunds does something, it may not get well known.
Okay. One thing we discuss in the report are the need for that the scientists are not always happy to look at our research from an ethical point of view, and that we want to strengthen the ethical review of the applications, research applications. And I don't know if this is discussed in the States right now, but we have just a couple of years ago changed our laws regulating research and ethical approval. But do you see, as we do then in the report, we see a need strengthening this, because I think we think that some of the people on the committees are not, and they ask them for forgiveness when I say this, but they may not be the best geneticists and not the lawyers that also know genetics or ethicists. They are extremely competent in other areas, and what we see a need of is people who really know this area, and this is a thing which we can find in other reports around the world.
So first, I think inculcating a sense of ethics in scientists, more of a sense of ethics in scientists, is always going to be a good thing. It's always going to be a difficult thing, and you're never going to be 100% effective at it. Most human traits, I think, fall in bell curves. And some scientists will be very interested, and some scientists will not be interested at all, and most will be somewhere in the middle. One way I think you can do that is point to some examples to them of scientists who didn't pay very much attention, who ended up with ruined careers. Or in the case of Hu Zhonghui, ended up in prison for 3 years. I think scientists, even scientists who are not inherently motivated strongly by ethics, are strongly motivated to be able to keep their reputations, their jobs, their grants, and so on. And if you can show them, as I think you can, that getting caught doing unethical things is bad for that, that's helpful. I also think, though, in the United States, human subjects research is governed by something we call IRBs, institutional review boards. And they are made up of, having served on one myself, I can say that they're not necessarily made up of the best and smartest people, because I served on one. But they are made up of people who are hardworking and dedicated to the issues. And I think they tend to be more pro-science. Stanford does not pick anti-science people to be on its IRBs. And so they're a little bit biased in that direction. But they are thoughtful. I think they can do a good job. However, even more important, again, and it's like the big companies, Stanford or the Karolinska Institute, it's got a reputation. And it wants to uphold that reputation. And so I can think of one or two contexts, none I think involving genetic engineering at Stanford, where there was an issue and the IRB thought it was probably okay, but it was really controversial. And so they asked the researchers to talk about it with the vice provost for research to let the university know this was happening and see if the university had some thoughts. And the university sometimes then asks that they talk to the general counsel's office and the lawyers in the university. So again, I think there is some advantage in institutions that have skin in the game, would be an American expression, have some assets to lose, including reputational assets, that will discourage some of the worst abuses. It'll never stop everything. Murder has been illegal for a long time, but murders still happen, at least in the United States. I assume I've seen enough detective books out of Sweden that I think they still happen here. So you won't get a perfect solution, and I think we can get better. But I don't think, at least to my knowledge in the U.S., I don't think we're in I think we've got a decent situation. China, on the other hand, had all the relevant committees on paper, but they didn't have the length of time, the experience, the culture of, and discipline to take them seriously. And I think that's part of what happened with Hu Zhonghui.
Elisabeth, do you think we need to strengthen that process that we...
I do, yes, I do. There are areas that have such societal impact, potential for societal impact, and where, well, one of the things that Smer is set to protect is human dignity in healthcare and medical research, and human dignity. And now I'm really interested to hear what Hank has to say about this, can be viewed in different ways. Is it just about the dignity of existing human beings, this particular research subject or that particular person, or is it also about future generations and mankind and our society, how it is affected by these things? If we were to, in the future sometime, do research where germline genome editing actually is carried out, or this enhancement issues, how would that affect our views of what it is to be a human, our society? How would that affect our views on our future children? How would the future generations be affected? And in our legislation, it says that you're not allowed to perform research that is not in keeping with respect for human dignity. But when it comes to the risk assessments, it's all about the research subjects, risks to the research subjects, and not risks to society or humanity or future generations or what have you. Yeah. So how do we sort of handle that issue?
So that's a great question. And I will say our IRB system is banned from considering risks beyond the research participants. It can consider the benefits to the research participant and medicine, society, etc. But it can only consider risks to the research participant. It's explicitly told you cannot consider risks to society at all. That's not your issue. There are others at other levels who do make that their issue. And I think we should think about society generally. I, however, am, I don't know, you said pessimistic for something else and I said skeptical. I think I'll use skeptical for this. I'm skeptical about the concept of human dignity. I think human beings have dignity that needs to be respected. And I think that applies to some extent to things on the edge of human personhood, so corpses. I think there is some dignity that needs to be respected. Embryos, I think there is some dignity that needs to be respected. Is it the same as of living people? No, but it's something. But I don't know what human dignity means. I mean, if you told me to review this in terms of human dignity, I worry that human dignity is the term people use when there's something they don't like and they can't come up with a good argument about it. And so they say, I'm going to play my trump card, human dignity. The issues of effects on society as a whole, I think, are quite important. And through the lens of existing humans, and the next couple generations of humans, and the rest of the biosphere as well. But I really don't think we should spend much time worrying about people 100 years from now. Because A, the chance that we will guess right about what's going to be happening 100 years from now is very low. And B, when it happens, it's going to be their world. It's not our world. And if you look 100 years back, or 200 years back, 200 years back, I assume most of our ancestors were peasants. Mine were. And they lived in a very, very different universe than the one we live in. And 100 years from now, what will our descendants be like, look like? What will they want? I hope they will want some of the things that we want, but I can't guarantee it.
I'm sure they will want clean air, pure water, beautiful environment. So we do have some concerns about what kind of a world we are leaving to our descendants. And that also includes, to some extent, these things.
So, yes, and they'll want a world where they don't have to have the air conditioning on 24 hours a day in Stockholm to keep it cool. There are some things that are more concrete, and I think the environmental ones are that way. Will they be worried about enhanced humans? I don't know. Enhancement is a complicated subject. Much of what we do, much of what we've done since we came out of the trees has been in an effort to enhance ourselves. I'll let you know, this is not my natural fur. This is an enhancement. These are in part medical, but they're in part enhancing. And I didn't use my wings to get here from San Francisco. All these technologies are enhancements. Enhancement isn't necessarily a bad thing, and what's viewed as right and wrong will change over time.
Exactly.
And we shouldn't assume that. So for the next 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, I think we can and should make some guesses. But we should remember that not only should people in the far future have the right to make their own decisions in their own world, but they're going to whatever we want anyway.
Of course.
They're the ones who will be there, not us.
Of course, but we need to discuss these issues today and for the next couple of decades, perhaps.
We need to discuss. We need not to fool ourselves into thinking that we can today lay down the right answers for 100 years from now.
Of course.
That's true, but shouldn't we shouldn't give up thinking about it? And when we launch research projects or something else, that we might need to think about what Elisabeth said, not just the persons involved as
Yes.
research subjects, but also what affects these projects or programs has in the long run, because I can imagine what people say 3 generations from now wants and things and like that. We are not that different from my grandparents or isn't that?
But we probably are.
Do you think? I know.
Gay pride parades probably didn't exist 150
isn't that
years ago, for
because
example. Or women voting,
yeah,
for example.
But you took the
Or
peasant.
women law professors.
Oh, we shouldn't stop with it. But I mean, if you take a peasant, say, 50, 60, 70, 100 years ago, they could grow some carrots which were not good for you.
Yeah.
But if you take someone today with the tools of genome engineering, he or she can do really good things, but also some less good things.
And I think we have plenty of, so first we should always keep thinking about those, if only because it's fun. It's really interesting, intellectually stimulating, and that's kind of why we academics at least do what we do. But we should also think about them, but we shouldn't overestimate our knowledge and ability to be right. We shouldn't think that we will have the right answers for the distant future. For the near future, yes, we should think I loved your example of gene drives for disease. This is not a fair complaint. I'm not complaining about your report. It was supposed to be about humans. It's about humans. I think we actually need to we across the world need to spend much more time thinking and working on gene editing on non-humans, because that's happening much faster. We're much less concerned about having a disabled puppy or kitten born, let alone a sheep or a mosquito, than we are babies. We're particularly risk averse about humans, and that will slow the adoption of technologies in a useful way. We're not so worried about the rest of the biosphere, and we should be. So yes, we need to think about it, look at it. The mosquito example, we may be able to make mosquitoes. We may be able to eliminate mosquitoes. That's one use, the one you mentioned. We may also, more subtly, because who knows what would happen to the ecosystem if mosquitoes disappeared. There are things that eat mosquitoes, like bats and birds. We may be able to make mosquitoes that can't be infected with the malarial plasmodium. Yeah. If the mosquitoes don't get malaria, people don't get malaria. And if people don't get malaria, 440,000 people a year survive who currently die. But the implications of letting these out when they can't be contained with any borders are huge. So yes, I think we do need to think broadly in space and in time. But we need to do so with humility. Time
is running fast here, and I are two of our recommendations I want to ask you very quickly. And the first we already talked about more or less, and that's germline editing. The Oviedo Convention, ratified by many European countries, puts a ban on it. Mm-hmm. Do you think that in the near future that ban will be taken away?
You asking for a political prediction?
No, yes. On
the political prediction, I cannot say. I think if it proves to be doable in a safe and effective way, which I think is likely but not certain, then I believe many countries, but not all, would allow human germline editing in some circumstances. But different countries with different histories and cultures will reach different results, and that's fine. Whether the Council of Europe will change the Convention of Oviedo, I don't know. Okay. But the other thing I need to say about this, in my book, I took a position that was sort of guaranteed to get me in trouble from both sides. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with germline editing. We change the next generation in everything we do. From whether we switch to electric cars, to what kind of education we give them, to whether we vaccinate them, etc. And in fact, the human germline genome is not a thing. There's 7.8 billion different human germline genomes. They change every generation. I don't have exactly the same DNA that my parents got from their parents, and my children don't have exactly the same DNA that I got from my parents, because during the process of making eggs and sperm, there are mutations, there are changes, and human activity influences those changes. Agriculture changed the human genome. We all have more copies of a gene that is useful in digesting starch than our hunter-gatherer ancestors did, because once we started farming, we ate a lot more starch. And people with more copies of that gene were more successful, and now we all have several copies. Medicine changes the genome. If you keep people alive who wouldn't otherwise be alive and it's a genetic condition, that changes the incidence. So I'm not worried about, I don't think there's a line that can't be crossed. On the other hand, I don't think it's going to be very useful.
Do you think we will?
I think it has a lot to do with what kind of risks we are willing to accept, because the risk will never be nil. So what risks will we be willing to accept? And that has a lot to do also with the benefits and the alternatives to achieving those benefits. Personally, I'm skeptical, once again, to lifting the ban in the near future, but who can tell? As Hank said, it's a political decision.
And you'd really need a compelling case. You'd both need evidence of safety, and the most compelling, I can't think of many, but say a couple that both have the same genetic disease, they're healthy enough, they want to have kids, and the only way they can have a child that is genetically theirs without the child having that disease is gene editing. That's a fairly compelling case.
Yeah. Can I just say one thing? Yeah. And Hank used the word, we need to go forward with humility, and as lawyers, we know a lot about use of power and also about abuse of power. And human beings have abused powers in many different ways to each other and to nature and to animals. And this is also an area where I think we need to be humble and be careful of abuse of power.
Okay,
certainly.
So I think we reached the end. There was one thing more I wanted to ask you, and that was, we say in the report that we should have efforts should be made to expand and deepen social debate and topic. I don't want to talk about it with it, because you have in words and in this conversation proven that that is important and should be done. So thank you very, very much for this. But before you run down, there might be time for questions from our audience, or questions. No. But that no is for the internet. But what about the large group of journalists sitting here?
The group of important and influential journalists sitting here.
no questions.
Excellent journalist sitting here.
Thank you.
We said it all.
Thanks a million. It was great fun.
It was indeed great fun. Thank you, Hank.
Talk.
Thank you.